Cathaoirleach, I want to formally move amendment number 5 in my name, and the first section of that amendment reads and it encapsulates the actual amendment, or the intent of the amendment, and it says Dáil Éireann formally declares that a housing emergency exists in the state, and while this emergency continues, the right of any person to remain in the dwelling in which the person currently resides will take precedence over any property right of any other person. And there are actions flowing from that. But fundamentally, Cathaoirleach, the greatest issue facing this country now and for quite some time is the housing emergency which we have out there. Minister Coveney himself, back in May, is quoted in the Examiner as saying that he accepts that there is a housing emergency there. And the housing emergency is very, very clear to the thousands of people who are homeless currently. There are 6,847 people homeless in Ireland, and 2,470 of those are children. Yesterday we heard figures whereby 420 families lost their homes over the last 3 months, or 4 a day. Many of them forced to hand back their homes by banks and building societies, others repossessed. And this is the situation that we have in this country. And as I said, the Minister himself has accepted that there is a housing emergency. He's quoted publicly as saying that. I myself heard Minister Fitzgerald, the Taoiseach here, about a fortnight ago on Leaders' Questions, acknowledge that there is a housing emergency. And what we need to do is take real action to ensure that those people who face the ultimate trauma of losing the roof over their heads are protected. And it is necessary and essential and urgent that this Dáil formally declares a housing emergency to ensure that citizens are in a position whereby we have a halt to evictions from both private homes and from rental properties, and we have a rent freeze, and that private property rights are made subject to the common good, and that the right of individuals and families to remain in their own homes supersedes the right to private property while that emergency is in existence. And I want to say that we have this situation in another area. This government has declared a financial emergency and has introduced FEMPI legislation to cut pay and pensions of public servants. And they have renewed that emergency on the 30th of June last. We are in a situation here where there is huge trauma, homelessness, and evictions on a daily basis, and we need to ensure that families who face that situation through no fault of their own, that they are protected and that they have a roof over their head this Christmas. I'd also say that the housing emergency is absolutely necessary. The formal declaration of a housing emergency is absolutely necessary if the Taoiseach's request to the European Union for funding for the building of houses, and he has written formally to the EU on this issue. But of course, while we have no housing emergency declared, it's quite clear that the EU will not take that request seriously. And of course there has been no response to that request, because we need, as I said, the declaration of a housing emergency to ensure that the EU knows exactly the huge problems that people have in this country, families have in this country, some living in tents, some living in hostels, some living in hotels. And currently, Focus Ireland tell us that 20 families per month and 40 children per month are made homeless. And of course, a lot of the situation is arising through evictions by banks and building societies, forcing families out of homes that are repossessed or where buy-to-let properties landlords are being forced to sell by the banks. And the CSO told us very recently that there are 14,500 buy-to-let properties in arrears of more than 2 years. And unfortunately, whether the tenants in those properties know it or not, they face eviction, because that is what has been happening. The biggest number of homeless families over the last 12 months or so have been where they were in private rented accommodation in buy-to-let properties whose landlords were forced to sell up by their banks. And that simply needs to be stopped. We need to take this seriously, this whole question of the housing emergency seriously. As I said, we need to declare that emergency. We need to stop evictions from mortgage properties and from buy-to-let properties. We need to freeze rents, and we need the emergency to have any chance of accessing EU funds. Of course, this situation This situation has developed as well from the privatisation of the public housing programme back in the early 2000s. The government of the day, Fianna Fáil government, decided effectively to privatise the whole public housing programme. I recall myself, as a member of South Tipperary County Council at the time, saying on the day that that was announced at our housing meeting that this would give rise to huge problems into the future, and that we require large numbers of local authority public housing provided for our citizens. And indeed, in the 70s, we were able to build 8, 9, 10,000 local authority houses each year, and we need to get back to that. Finally, Cathaoirleach, I'd just like to say again that I formally move this amendment, because what we've been hearing from the Minister and from the government over the last period is simply tinkering around the edges. We need a housing emergency to make real change, to ensure that every citizen, every family has a right to have a roof over their head this Christmas, and that we once and for all, stop the whole question of the battering ram that reminds us of the repossessions, that reminds us of the battering rams way down the centuries in this country. I formally move the amendment, Cathaoirleach. Thank you.